The glass didn't shatter loudly. That was the strange thing. It slipped from the edge of the mahogany side table during the toast. Someone's elbow, maybe, or just the vibration of 60 people laughing at the same moment. And when it hit the marble floor of the Ashford Estate's great hall, it made a sound like a single quiet note. A small, clean break. And then the laughter continued, and the champagne pooled between the tiles. And no one looked down. Simone Ashford noticed. She always noticed the things other people decided weren't worth noticing. She was standing near the east window, far enough from the center of the room that she could observe without being observed, which was a habit she had developed over 11 years of attending Ashford family gatherings. 11 years of learning where to stand. 11 years of learning when to speak, and more importantly, when to go quiet and let the room be what it wanted to be without her in it. Outside, the grounds of the Ashford estate in Savannah stretched toward the tree line in the late October dark. Torches had been arranged along the garden path for the occasion. The annual Ashford Legacy Dinner, which the family had been holding every fall for 32 years, first as a small reunion, and gradually, as the Ashford name grew into something with real weight in Georgia, as a semi-formal affair with a guest list that included senators and developers, and the kind of people who got their calls returned on the first ring. Her husband Elliot's mother, Gloria Ashford, had spent 3 weeks organizing the seating chart alone. Simone had not been consulted about the seating chart. She had not been consulted about the menu either, though she had offered. Gloria had thanked her graciously, the way one thanks a child who offers to help carry something heavy, and then arranged everything herself. That was fine. Simone had learned to let those things be fine. What she had not yet learned, what 11 years had not been able to teach her, was how to stand in a room full of people who had known each other their whole lives and not feel the specific coldness of being the person who did not belong there, and who everyone was too polite to say so to directly. She was 41 years old. She had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in East Atlanta with her mother and her grandmother and a radiator that worked about 60% of the time in winter. She had gotten a partial scholarship to Georgia Tech and paid the rest by working nights at a fulfillment center, loading boxes onto conveyor belts for 6 hours while memorizing engineering coursework in the break room. She had started her first company at 27 with a $12,000 personal loan and a laptop with a cracked screen. By 34, that company had been acquired for $70 million. The second company she built was worth considerably more. None of that mattered to Gloria Ashford. Gloria Ashford was 70 years old and had never in her life needed to prove anything to anyone, and she had a very particular vision of what the woman married to her youngest son should look like, and Simone, in every version of that vision, was not it. It had not been stated plainly. It was never stated plainly. The Ashfords were too well-mannered for plain statements. Instead, it lived in smaller things. The way Gloria introduced her at parties, and this is Elliot's wife, followed by a slight pause, as though a name might or might not follow, depending on how much effort seemed worth it. The way Elliot's older brother, Douglas, and here she caught herself, because in this family, Douglas was the name she'd learned to brace for whenever he entered a room. The way Douglas had once, 2 years ago at this same dinner, asked her if she was enjoying working in the tech space, with the particular inflection of someone who found the phrase mildly amusing. She had told him she ran a company. He had nodded in the way people nod when they're already thinking about the next thing they want to say. The way she had been seated, for 3 years running, at the far end of the table, not the children's table. The Ashfords were too refined for anything so obvious. But the satellite table, the one that held the guests who were adjacent to the family rather than of it. Business associates. A distant cousin's boyfriend. A family friend's elderly aunt who talked mostly about her roses. Simone, who was legally a member of this family, who shared a last name with the woman who had arranged the seating chart. Elliot had noticed. She knew he'd noticed because he'd apologized, privately, in the car on the way home each time, and each time she'd said it was okay because she didn't know how to explain to him that what hurt wasn't the seat. What hurt was that he'd apologized in the car and not at the table. That was the shape of 11 years. Tonight, the great hall was full. 63 people, by Simone's count. The kind of gathering that would have felt enormous to her once, back when 63 people in a room meant a neighborhood cookout or a church basement fundraiser. Now she could move through rooms like this without her hands shaking, which had taken years. Social ease was a skill she'd discovered, not a quality you were born with, and she'd had to build it the same way she'd built everything else, slowly, deliberately, by doing it wrong first and studying what went wrong. She watched Gloria work the room from across the hall. The woman was remarkable in that way, genuinely. 70 years old, and still moving through a party like she was conducting an orchestra. A hand on an arm here. A laugh perfectly timed there. Her silver hair pinned at the back of her neck, in a style that probably had a name Simone didn't know. People lit up when Gloria turned her attention to them. That was a real gift. Simone could respect it even while understanding that it had never once been directed at her. Elliot was near the fireplace with his college roommate, and two men Simone recognized as being from the state legislature. He caught her eye from across the room and gave her a small smile, the kind that meant he knew where she was and was glad she was there, and had not yet registered that she had been standing alone by the window for 20 minutes. She smiled back. This too she had learned. The dinner was served at 8. Simone was seated at the secondary table, again, this time between a man named Reginald, who was a business associate of Elliot's father, and a woman named Patrice, who had married into a family that owned textile mills across the Carolinas. They were both perfectly pleasant. Reginald talked about a golf trip to Scotland. Patrice talked about renovating a property in Palm Beach. Simone listened and asked the right questions, and smiled at the right moments and ate her salmon without tasting it. At the main table, 4 feet away, Douglas Ashford was holding court. Douglas was 48, broad-shouldered, with their father's jaw and their mother's confidence, and he had grown up understanding that rooms were meant to arrange themselves around him. He was not cruel, exactly. Cruelty implied effort. Douglas simply operated from the assumption that certain people mattered and certain people were scenery, and he had sorted Simone into the second category so early in their acquaintance that she suspected he'd done it before she'd finished her first sentence. He had also, over 11 years, said things. Not threats, not slurs, nothing that could be cleanly named and addressed. Just comments. Asides delivered with a half smile, pitched just low enough that you could never be certain who else had heard. The thing about her hair at the second Thanksgiving, when she'd worn it natural for the first time at an Ashford event, and Douglas had said, with what appeared to be genuine puzzlement, that he didn't know Elliot's wife was going for that look. The comment at Easter 3 years ago, when she'd mentioned a deal her company was closing, and Douglas had said, "Oh, is that the kind of tech thing where you don't actually need to know how to code?" And then laughed when she'd explained, patiently, that she did in fact know how to code. The comment that lived most persistently in her body, the one she returned to, in the way your tongue returns to a sore tooth, had happened at last year's dinner. She had been reaching for the breadbasket when Douglas, speaking to the man beside him, but with his voice projected just enough, had said, "Elliot always did like a project." She had put the bread back. She had taken a sip of water. She had not looked at him. Elliot, sitting 3 seats away, had not heard, or had heard and decided not to have heard. She was not sure which was worse. Tonight, Douglas was in a particular kind of mood, expansive, performative, the mood he got when he was comfortable and well-fed and had an audience he considered worthy. He was telling a story about a land deal that had apparently been a spectacular win for the family's development company, gesturing broadly, voice rising at the right moments, and the people around him were doing what people around Douglas Ashford always did, which was laugh and lean in and wait to find out what he was going to say next. Simone watched him from the secondary table and felt the thing she always felt at moments like this. which was a very specific combination of exhaustion and clarity. Exhaustion at still being here, still performing the patience required to be in a room where her presence was tolerated rather than wanted. Clarity because she had been doing this long enough to know exactly what she was looking at. A man who had inherited the confidence of someone who had never been seriously wrong about anything. Surrounded by people who would not be the first to tell him. Dessert was being cleared when it happened. She had not been watching Douglas specifically. She had been talking to Patrice about something, Palm Beach again, or maybe the textile mills. She'd lost the thread when she heard Douglas's voice shift. Not louder, exactly. A different register. The one that meant he'd decided something was funny. Someone should tell her, he said, that the catering staff uses the side entrance. She understood immediately who he meant. She understood before she turned to look, because she had known for 11 years the specific weight of that sentence in that voice directed in her direction, and her body had already processed it before her mind finished the work. The table near the fireplace, the main table, had gone slightly quiet, the particular quiet of people who heard something they weren't sure how to respond to. A few people looked away. Elliot, she saw, was looking at Douglas with an expression she couldn't read from 40 feet away. He did not say anything. Douglas picked up his wine glass. Something shifted in the room. Not loudly. Not the way things shift in movies with music and close-ups and the camera finding everyone's faces. Just a small, clean change in the air, the way a room changes when someone opens a window from outside. One of the catering staff, a young woman, new, who'd been moving quietly between the tables all evening, had stopped near the side wall. She was looking at a phone, a work phone, Simone assumed, something for coordinating with the kitchen. But the young woman's face had changed. She was looking at the phone, the way people look at things they can't quite process, and then she looked up, directly at Simone. Simone didn't know why. She would piece it together later. But something in that look made her turn toward the television on the north wall, the one that had been muted all evening, showing a golf tournament that no one was watching. Someone had changed the channel. Or the catering company had a notification set. Or it was simply the particular alignment of coincidences that the universe occasionally produces to prove that it has a sense of irony. The screen was showing a live broadcast, a business segment, one of those evening financial programs that ran on cable, and on the screen, in a graphic beneath the anchor's face, was a name: Simone Ashford, CEO. The segment was about a federal infrastructure contract, the largest contract of its kind awarded to a private technology company in the history of the state of Georgia. The graphic showed a number. The number had 10 digits. The anchor was saying something. The television was muted, so no one could hear the words. But the graphic remained. The name remained. The number remained. The great hall of the Ashford estate was silent. Not the social silence of a pause between conversations. The specific, absolute silence of 63 people who had collectively and simultaneously been presented with information that reorganized everything they thought they understood about the room they were standing in. Douglas Ashford had not moved. His wine glass was still in his hand, raised slightly, the way it had been when he'd made his comment. He was looking at the screen. His expression was not readable in the ordinary way. It was the expression of a man running a very fast calculation and not yet having arrived at the answer. Gloria Ashford, at the head of the main table, was also looking at the screen. Her face had gone very still, the kind of still that is not calm. Elliot was looking at Simone. She did not look at the screen. She had already seen it. She had, in fact, known about the contract since Tuesday, when her COO had called her with the confirmation, and she'd sat in her car in the parking garage for about 4 minutes before trusting herself to drive. She had told Elliot Wednesday evening. She had not told anyone else, because there had not been an appropriate moment, and also because, and she understood this about herself, with the clarity that came from being very honest, in private, about her own motivations. She had not wanted to give this family the opportunity to perform enthusiasm they did not feel. She had not planned for tonight to be the moment. But here was tonight. She set down her dessert fork. She folded her napkin and placed it beside her plate. She stood. She did not make a speech. That was not who she was and never had been. She walked through the secondary table, between Reginald and Patrice, across the marble floor that separated the satellite table from the main one. And she walked to where Elliot was sitting, and she put her hand on his shoulder, and she said, quietly, "I'd like to go home." He stood immediately. He put his hand over hers. The room was still silent. Douglas lowered his wine glass. He opened his mouth. She could see him assembling something, some response, some recalibration, and then he closed it again. There was nothing to assemble. The television graphic was still visible over his left shoulder. The number still had 10 digits. Gloria Ashford said her name. Not Elliot's wife, her name, her full name. For the first time in 11 years. Simone looked at her mother-in-law across the room. "Congratulations," Gloria said. The words sat in the silence of the great hall for a moment. Simone understood that it cost the woman something to say it, and she also understood that one word in the right moment did not rewrite 11 years. And she also understood that she was 41 years old and had built 2 companies from nothing and had managed, through sheer will and precision, and the knowledge that exhaustion is not the same as defeat, to become someone whose name appeared in 10-digit graphics on federal broadcast television, and that she could decide, freely and without owing anyone an explanation, what she wanted this moment to mean. She nodded once, measured, composed. Then she and Elliot walked out of the great hall, and the sound of her heels on the marble floor was, and the silence they left behind them, the loudest sound in the building. In the car, Elliot was quiet for a long time. The Savannah streets passed outside the window, lit orange by the old lamps that lined the historic district, and the Spanish moss hung from the oaks like dark lace. "I should have said something," he said, at the table. "Years ago, I should have said something." She considered this. She had considered it many times herself, in many forms, in many late evenings when the exhaustion had come home with her and she'd lain awake running the math on what things cost and what they were worth. "Yes," she said, not unkindly, just accurately. He nodded. He was not a man who made excuses, which was one of the things she'd loved about him first, and still did, even through the years when the quality had made things complicated. "What do you want to do?" he asked. She looked out the window at the trees, and the lights, and the dark water at the edge of the park they were passing. What she wanted, she thought, was the same thing she had always wanted, which was to be in a room and be seen clearly. Not as a project, not as an addition, not as a complication in someone else's story, but as herself, plainly and completely, without having to explain the context, or provide credentials, or wait for someone to consult a television graphic before deciding she was worth looking at directly. She had built 2 companies. She had a federal contract with 10 digits. She had learned how to walk into a room without her hands shaking. She was going to be okay. She had always been going to be okay. That had never been in question, not really. Not from the moment she'd sat in a break room at 2 a.m. with a borrowed engineering textbook and decided that the world was not going to stay the size it currently was. What she was still figuring out was what to do with the people who had always been going to be surprised by that. "Drive home," she said. Elliot drove. The estate receded behind them. The Spanish moss stirred in the October wind. And in the great hall, 61 people sat with a silence that would take them a long time to find the right words for.